and welcome to Chuck's Culture Channel, your YouTube home for lively conversation on the lively arts in St. Louis and beyond. This episode is part one of a two-part talk with Leonard Slatkin. He's the Conductor Laureate of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra and a man of many parts in general. But in this first conversation, we're talking about a special series of SLSO concerts that he's conducting January 13th through 20th, 2024, focusing on the intersection between classical music and jazz. Okay, and here I am live with Leonard Slatkin, Conductor Laureate of the St. Louis Symphony. How do you want me to refer to you, Leonard or Maestro or?
Leonard will be just fine.
Okay.
In fact, there's a story about that. When I came back to the orchestra after the 10 years in secondary roles, and I was the music director, at the very first rehearsal, the principal double bass, Henry Lowe, said, "Maestro, in measure 72, do you want an accent here?" And I looked over, I said, "Henry, for 10 years, you called me Leonard. What's with this maestro stuff?" So Leonard is just fine.
Something about being the laureate. Well, the primary thing we wanted to talk about is a very interesting series of concerts you have coming up with the orchestra at the Two Hill Center, which is virtually behind me right now. And it all focuses on the intersection between vernacular and, for lack of a better term, classical music. And I would like to get some impression about what gave you the idea for this. Where did this all start?
Knowing that the orchestra was going to be displaced for a couple of years, my thought turned to doing something different, something that perhaps I wouldn't normally do in the regular scheme of traditional subscription concerts in Powell. It's not that I wouldn't do it, but maybe not this way. It's a slightly more intimate setting. It's different, and I thought that reaching an audience, perhaps, of people who are maybe not used to coming to hear the orchestra out quite far away from Powell, really, when you think about it.
Yeah.
The chance to find something that appeals to a different audience, that made it really interesting for me. And the thought turned to this concept of how did the 20th century concert music in America evolve? What made it different than anything we had done before? It also turned out that this particular set of concerts fell around the same time that our recordings of Gershwin that we made 50 years ago were remastered and reissued. Yeah. In fact, they've never gone out of print. They've always been bestsellers.
Yeah, made in fact for Vox originally and in surround sound, as I recall.
Yeah. And the sound was always excellent, and it was in quad.
Yes.
Remember quad?
Yes, I do.
Now we just call it surround sound, I guess. Whatever. We had with the Cuban Overture, we had to actually put the Latin percussion behind me in the audience so we could get something that appeared to come out of the rear speakers. I don't know if it's been remastered in that way or not. Not sure. Anyway, so as soon as I thought about that, I thought, the thing I'd like to do is just to explore different ways that composers, not just Americans, but others as well, have sought to use how as you use the word vernacular, which is the word I prefer here, because we're not talking about jazz per se. Jazz was very new. It was born out of blues and ragtime, would evolve into swing as the 20s ended. And it wasn't really the improvisatory art that we think about now.
Right.
So indeed, it's a kind of moving towards finding an American language that was not based in folk music, not based in spiritual, not based in gospel. And this was the way to do it. Our popular music that Gershwin honed to perfection, along with various other colleagues, of course, Irving Berlin, so many others. But we thought we'd try to look at this particular time and see music that came before Gershwin and music that comes afterwards, as well as other people who were around in Gershwin's time. And it's a fascinating 3-concert series. You can't do everything, of course not, but we can give a pretty good view for those who choose to come to all 3. You'll get a very good perspective of how American music really became part of the concert hall experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I was looking at the repertoire for the 3 concerts earlier today, and yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful variety of stuff. It is it's very typical of what I think of you doing anyway, as a conductor, because you have, I've been a fan of the symphony for decades, and I remember your tenure well as the music director, and you always had this strong eclectic sense in your work. I mean, you weren't bound by traditional categories.
No, and it was always due to my upbringing that this eclecticism occurred. The fact that my parents led 3 lives musically. They were one half of a world-renowned string quartet, playing the classics of Beethoven, Schubert, Bartok, and contemporary works as well. They were part of the studio system in the late 30s through the mid 1950s. My mom was the first cellist at Warner's. My dad was the concertmaster at Fox. And my mother's brother was the pianist at Warner's. So if you've seen any films from that time period, so it's cello solo or piano solo, and it's Warner's, it's my mom and uncle, and it's Fox, and it's a violin solo, it's my dad. So they had that. And then they had the popular music industry,
Right,
particularly epitomized by Capitol Records and its artists like Nat King Cole and George Shearing and Nancy Wilson, but most particularly Frank Sinatra. But there were also the jazz aspects as well. I hung out at jazz clubs all the time, illegally, but since they knew my folks, I somehow snuck in. In fact, I was told by a friend a few weeks ago, apparently I took a date to a nightclub that was called Shelley's Manhole. Shelley Mann was a great, great West Coast drummer who had his own club. I used to go there every weekend. And I took a date to one where Miles Davis was playing. And Miles Davis looked, apparently, and realized that there were 2 kids, 16 years old, at this club. And he pointed at us. He didn't want us there. So we discreetly tried to leave. Then we discreetly came right back.
There is, in fact, a lot of music in these programs that some people are not going to recognize right away. I was looking at the list here. You've got
as well as composers that are not known.
Antile, for example, is probably not.
Antile is one. John Alden Carpenter is another. Mary Lou Williams is perhaps a name not so familiar. And these were all people who built their music. In the case of Antile, he wrote his jazz symphony, which is not a symphony, and it's not
really jazz.
And it's very short. It basically features a piano solo. But he wrote it for the same concert that the premiere of his most infamous work was played, the Ballet Mécanique, for pianos and all kinds of percussion going on. I mean, that caused a riot. But the jazz symphony had apparently received great acclaim from that audience. So here was this guy who was always called the bad boy of American music. He liked riling people up. So we get a chance to hear George Antile. Carpenter was a more traditional composer, but ventured into this vernacular world in this odd little ballet pantomime, as he called it. Now, Crazy Cat was an actual cartoon figure.
Yes, George Harriman. Yeah,
that's right. Very popular, very mischievous. He could do things like take his tail off, make a question mark out of it, stuff like that. And so this is a ballet that tells a story about him and Ignatz the mouse. So we'll probably, hopefully the program note will recount the tale.
Yeah.
Marianne Williams was one of the great jazz pianists of our time, completely overshadowed because there were not many women in jazz in the 20s through the mid 40s, certainly. She wrote this piece called the Zodiac Suite, which is 12 movements. We're not playing all 12, but with the Arundel Quartet, we'll be doing, I think, 8 of them. And her language goes hand in hand with another composer that we hear on these programs, that's Duke Ellington.
Right.
It's often forgotten. In a way, Gershwin is the one who leads us into the concert hall, but he's doing it trying to enter the world of classical music. Ellington is taking his background from big band and jazz and trying also to enter the classical phase, but not quite as blatantly as Gershwin did. I mean, Gershwin really wanted to be a serious so-called classical music composer. The Rhapsody opened the door, but then things opened up with the Concerto in F, American in Paris, Porgy and Bess, etc. And of course, he dies at the age of 36, so who knows? But Ellington lived a long life, and the last 25 years or so of it, he spent writing many works that incorporated larger forces. They were sacred services that he wrote for churches, and several works that involved orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
The one we're playing is called The Three Black Kings, and it is a work where he depicts biblical as well as Martin Luther King using jazz elements, but placing them more in the context of the symphony orchestra as the carpeting for the jazz work that goes on. There are solos from sax and trumpet, whatever, but it's not a straight out jazz piece. It falls more in kind of like three little tone poems. I've done it now a couple times. Extraordinary man, extraordinary thinker. And Mary Lee Williams kind of follows his harmonic direction. With Ellington, often you didn't know where he was going to go. Where were the harmonies going to take him? I don't think of Ellington as a melodist so much as I do a really pioneer and innovator when it comes to his use of harmony. And it's apparent in his piece. And Mary Lee Williams, very much the same thing. We become aware of some very advanced chord progressions, kinds that you didn't think about in the jazz world of the time.